Says it's live on my end.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to wait for it to show up on the YouTube side to make sure that it is. Not seeing anything yet. Oh, there we go. Yep, cool. We are on. All right.
Internet trolls are at it again.
Gotta love, technology. But okay, to everybody who is tuning in or will be tuning in, welcome to our chats segment of the It Will Come show. Of course, I'm your host, George C.L.C. Samuels, and we are here again with the lovely Rachel Happe. It's been great, actually, seeing all of the things that you've been working on, and also knowing that you've got the the State of Community Management report. So today we are going to dive straight into that. Rachel is the principal and co-founder of the Community Roundtable. But let's get straight into it. Rachel, What's the first thing you'd love to cover?
Oh gosh, there's so much, right? Like, I feel like our work has really collided with so many things that are going on in society right now. And it's kind of the culmination of a lot of different trends and issues and challenges, and it's all a hot mess, right?
Yep.
But there's also, I feel like we're in this liminal space right now where the past is done, but the future isn't here. And it's a very, it's both a very disconcerting time and it's a very exciting time. Yeah. And there's a lot of tension, and we're seeing this in the US. There's a lot of like tension and strike points, I guess, in that. And I think that's happening in organizations around the world. I think that's happening culturally. I think that's happening politically. It's funny because in 2008, maybe it was 2011. I don't remember the year. It all blends. But I keynoted at the Enterprise 2.0 conference in Boston, and I had this slide that basically said, a storm is coming.
Yeah. Yep.
Driven by technology, but has huge social political ramifications. And I hadn't looked at the slide in a while, and I brought it up last year, and I was like, oh, the storm's here. It's here. It's arrived.
Yep.
Can I pause? I have my windows open, and I think it's causing background noise, and I'm going to be right back.
No worries.
Sorry, the bane of being in the suburbs in the US right now is that you're working at home, and the landscapers, you need to keep track of the landscaping schedule.
Yep. That's all right. I couldn't hear much anyways, but
yeah, it's a privileged problem, but it's a loud one.
First world problems, right?
Yeah. Anyways, so I feel like the work that we've done in the early years, I think a lot of people didn't know what we were doing. They were kind of like, there's these online communities and people are chatting, and they're helping with customer support. Nah. Yeah. And like, it was just very esoteric to people. And I think we've kind of, kind of collided with where things are going. In a good way, because I think we've spent the last decade trying to understand, how do you manage and structure work in a different way that is not abusive and hierarchical? And I think, and that's driven kind of from, we were talking about personality and how personalities and temperament really drive things. I've always been someone who, like, you can't tell me what to do. I do not like being controlled or told what to do. I have the good fortune of having a daughter who is exactly like me.
Yep, gotta love that.
Challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to kind of say, you know what, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to be in an environment where I'm ranking myself against you, I'm competing against you, and one of us is going to be dominant and one of us is going to be submissive. However, that is historically, at least in the United States, it saturates everything that we do. It saturates how we are educated. It saturates how we think about family relationships. It saturates how we work. And it's killing us, right? It's making us anxious, right? Because we're always competing with everyone. And that puts you just personally in a defensive mode all the time. And that defensive mode drives anxiety. And it's deadly. It's deadly to like just everything. It's the heart of racism, right? Like,
yes,
this is where the work I'm doing and what's going on in the United States relate as well. And so, you know, I'm watching all of these things and reading a lot of history and trying to educate myself a little further on, like, how did we get so racist? Why was this the modality that we chose? And how, like, what are the things that we need to like fix it? And my background is operations management, at least professionally. And I really think structure drives behavior, right? So the governance, how we measure things, how we manage things, how we incent and reward people, all of those things drive our behavior. And so a lot of people come at the cultural thing and say, well, we just need to like talk to each other differently. And I'm like, we don't talk to each other differently because we're not rewarded for talking to each other differently. Like, we're set up to be antagonistic to each other because in grade school, there was only going to be a certain amount of A's, right? You know, like there was only so many people who could be perfect. And I'm like, what is that? You're saying a person is not perfect, or they are like,
according to who, right? Exactly, right?
We're both. All of us are both. And so there's this false narrative or assumption that underlies so much of how we organize ourselves. And I think my passion is kind of dismantling that and showing people how not to do that. Meaning, what's a structure that would change that cultural dynamic?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of where my head is right now, because it's a stew of stuff going on.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think the main thing that I kind of had it open-ended right at the beginning to say, like, where would you like to start? But I think as I was mentioning before we jumped on to live, was that, coming from different angles, there's that biohistory where I was saying that they're looking at epigenetics over history as well. So would you say structure is a driver, or is it a shaper of, these things that we're seeing?
I mean, you're right to call it a shaper, not a driver, meaning it's not the only thing. And I'm a big fan of BJ Fogg's behavioral model, which basically says there's 3 things that drive behavior or action. And it's how easy something is, how motivated somebody is, and a trigger. So you can play with those 3 things to shift behavior. One thing that I've added to his model and is important in the organizational context is value. Like, what behaviors have value versus none. And so the example I give a lot of the times is Facebook likes are incredibly easy, right? They've made that super easy to do. You don't have to have any motivation, really. Like, they trigger you all the time to like that button, right? And so it's not very meaningful because I wasn't really motivated. It was just there.
Yep,
And
exactly.
so if you're on the other end of that, it's hard to interpret because, okay, I have 100,000 fans, but what does that really mean? How many of them might actually activate? Probably not very many. And so I've always been a fan of building bigger barriers to entry to conversations, to communities, because you end up having a richer conversation. Now,
how does that play? Sorry, how does that play in with, like, people who are about like inclusion, right? Because barriers.
I was just going to go there, right? Which is, there is a fundamental tension in communities between inclusion and exclusion, right? One that you cannot get rid of. Because if you're all things to all people, you're nothing to no one, right? Like, you can't build that trust and that belonging and whatever. If, however, you're completely exclusive, things go bad in a hurry, right? You're not listening to the outside world. You're completely cut off. You start believing your own BS or whatever.
Yep.
And so you can't be either. You can't be totally inclusive. You can't be totally exclusive. And where you sit on that tension kind of determines what kind of community you are, right? And I often say, and I was having this conversation with Ewan Semple this morning because he was kind of ranting against tribalism, and I was like, but you need some boundaries. And he was like, and I was like, well, a tribe is just a community gone bad. And a community gone really bad is a cult. And it's all on this spectrum of inclusion, exclusion, right? And as humans, well, actually, I should back up, not as humans. As humans brought up in the system that we're brought up in, we want right answers. We don't like the middle ambiguity of like a little of both. Like that, there's a lot of people who get very uncomfortable.
Too uncertain.
Because they want to know what's right. And I'm like, there is no right. Like,
they still want it.
Like, how are you going to look at two babies and be like, that one's right? Like, you can't do it, right? Like,
but it's a hard one too, right? Because I mean, we're seeing also if nothing's right, then where do we draw the line when it comes to injustices too, right? And then also like pedophilia, that sort of stuff. And to be fair, it is agreed upon that we consider that to be bad and evil, right?
Yeah.
Where does
racism is bad and evil, right?
Right.
So I think there's extremes that you can put boundaries around and say, once you've gone over, like, cults are bad, right? If people have no self-efficacy anymore and they're bound to this community and they can't get out, that's bad, right? That's not okay. Which is basically what cults are. It's psychological control instead of physical control, but it's control nonetheless. So I think there is some hard edges there, but there's also a lot of in between those hard edges that people are just going to come down, and as long as you have that collective conversation with the community, that it's a joint understanding of how we are together. And actually, I had another podcast this week about communities, and it helped me understand why I talk about community management a lot instead of leadership or whatever, because I believe everybody can be a leader, and that's really self-determined, right? Am I going to step into the ring? Am I going to put myself out there? Am I going to assert myself? It helps to have a community that empowers you. to be a leader. That's absolutely necessary. But community facilitators are not necessarily the leaders of the community. They're not the dominant voice of the community.
Yes, 100%.
What they're doing, and this is what came up in the conversation this week, is they're the one managing the health of the system and saying, you know, we've gone too far this way. We've gone too far this way. Bring it. So they're the ones that are managing what we've all agreed to is in and out. But they're not the ones deciding that necessarily. They're just facilitating the decision of that.
Right. So if you were to use like the old, I guess, village or tribe model too, right? Like what type of people in that model would you say community managers of today are?
Probably the elders, right? Like there's always been the tribal elder who, when people can't agree on something, it eventually gets elevated to them. And I am not the person to speak about the history of that role.
Yep, fair.
But from my understanding, a lot of the really revered ones in Native cultures ask a lot of questions. They were more Socratic in their method. They didn't come and like put the fist down. They were like, you thought about, you know, can you see it from this perspective? Can you see it from this? Like, here's my experience. Like, again, they were facilitating that rather than being a judge and kind of making a decision, I think. Again.
Yep, fair.
Yeah, so, and I'm sure it was different across different tribes.
Yes.
And different groups. So I like, that's a broad swath generalization about.
Fair. Don't worry. We're generalizing here. But yeah, you know, I guess coming back to your structure, actually, the findings from the report. Now, you felt like it was definitely like groundbreaking over the last 5 years. You've been putting all this data together. What were the key highlights for you? And
well, so one thing that I did, and I'm getting some pushback on this, but I think actually that means it's really useful in that it's prompting hard questions, is I put a financial model around the generative business model.
Yeah.
So there's in financial terms, what do people contribute to communities and what do they get out? And that's a hard thing for people to grasp because the contributions that any individual make are behaviors, actions, content, expertise. They're not investing money. They're not putting a dollar bill on the table. And they're not getting that out, meaning they never translate to the financial. But that's how our organizations see value. And for better or for worse, we have to normalize value so that we can exchange different things for a set understanding of what value is. And the way I would equate this is my grandmother was a church lady. And in the US, what that means is she was constantly involved in church committees. She was one of the cooks, and the cooks at her church cooked for like 200 or 300 people like 3 times a month, right? Like that's just what they did. They did not get paid for any of that.
Yeah.
Right? The minister got paid. And a few years ago, I was like, what's more important, the church ladies or the minister? And one of the things that's been going on in small churches in the US is they're dying. And I'm like, that's because women all of a sudden could get actual paid work opportunities. And so if somebody was going to actually give them value back, they were gonna go do that. And so there's not as many church ladies to make lunch for everybody. And so I look at it and I'm like, I think the church ladies might have been more important than the minister, right? They're the ones that prompted people to come and stay and connect and all of those things that make a community a community. And the minister was the content, right? And we paid for the content, but we benefited from the church ladies.
Yes.
And we never saw that, like, and so I went out to my grandmother's funeral, and her church still has church ladies, and they had the big lunch afterwards. And the church ladies are in the kitchen and not really seen or heard. They're kind of taken for granted, right? And not entirely. The community definitely sees them as one type of leader, but they don't have the same stature and voice as the minister.
Yeah. But are they willing as well? I mean, a lot of the times they're volunteering their time, right?
Yep. Because they care about the community, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, and in that world, you're not, people aren't working crazy hours. They're not traveling all over the place. There's a sense of place that's different than my world right now. So the whole dynamic is a little different, but that's essentially, so like, my point is we don't see that value because we don't translate it into the language of value, which is money.
Money.
And until we do that, we can't help our executives see that value. We can't, and we definitely can't see our finance or help our finance team understand that value. Because they have no way of accounting for it or seeing it, or like, and so accounting is really important. And a number of years ago, and this is where it comes back to racism as well. A number of years ago, I was looking at corporate balance sheets. I don't know what I was doing. I was doing some kind of analysis, and it had been a while since I had looked at a corporate balance sheet. And I was like, where are the people on the asset side? And so I was talking to an accounting friend of mine, and he was like, yeah, they don't, like, that's too hard to calculate. I'm like, we amortize software, but we can't figure out the value of a person? Like, that seems just as vague, right? But we figured it out. Anyways, I had sat with that for years, and I'm like, no wonder we fire people like wholesale, like just in clumps, because we have no way of seeing their value. Yeah. And then earlier this year, I was reading the 1619 Project, one of the articles about the brutality of American capitalism. And everything clicked all of a sudden for me. And I was like, which is amortization was an innovation of accounting for slavery, because people got older and they couldn't produce as much. And so when should I kill off my slaves or sell them off or like not feed them or whatever, because they're producing less than they cost to support? That's a horrifying,
systems,
like, oh my God. And so then I was like, oh, they used to be on the asset side of the balance sheet because they were property.
Far out.
Right?
Yeah.
And once they were no longer property, we had to get rid of that line item, and we didn't replace it with anything.
My Lord.
Right? And so we don't see it anymore. And you add that to this trend that we're moving from a production environment to a knowledge economy, right? The robots, the algorithms, they're going to do everything that's been standardized. And they can produce at a level of quality and repeatability in a way humans never can, because we're not widgets. We're not mechanical parts, right? And so now our value is not a per hour, how much can we churn out? But our metrics are still around content and transactions, right? They're still, how much can you churn out? but it's not about that anymore. It's about what I know up here, my experience, my ability to see multiple things and put them together. And we have no ability to account for that. And so until we do, and the people who have that knowledge are the older people, the more experience, like the more experience you have, the better you are at doing some of that stuff, just because you have a wider set of experiences to pull from, right? They're typically more expensive. They're often the ones that we cut off at the knees. Like, my husband is 50 and he's like, I can't be out of the workforce right now because I'll never get another job.
Damn.
Because people don't see that value, right? Like, I'm being hyperbolic. I don't know if that's true or not. But that he's worried about that because that's the age where it's really hard to get a job. And I'm like, the elders, right? Going back to the elders are the ones that can like see nuance and find a way through and aren't so dogmatic about it has to be this or it has to be that. And in a world where most of our business problems, most of our social problems are complex problems, right? They're not complicated problems anymore. We can send somebody to the moon. We just did, right? Or not the moon, the space station. Yep. We can figure that out. It's not easy, but it's a mechanical thing that if we invest enough resources, we can eventually like figure it out. And there's a right answer, right? The spaceship is safe and it launches and it doesn't combust, right?
Yep.
But things like climate change, racism, any of those things are really complex and there's no one right answer. It's going to take thousands of little answers to fix the problem. And so if we're all trying to be right and find the right thing, we're going to fail. Yeah.
And then
that's the big innovation from the research is I feel really strongly that and the objection is you can't monetize people like that. And of course not, right? I can never capture the value of a relationship or the empathy somebody has or the emotional support that I get. I will say though, if you're getting more of that support, you're more likely to engage. And so if you measure engagement and complexity of engagement and the value of different types of engagement, that will increase if you're doing all that other stuff that you can't really measure well.
I mean, it's a really interesting point you bring because we can't, essentially, those things aren't measurable until someone figures it out, right, as well. Because the way I see it, and you've probably seen a lot of stuff that I post on Twitter about blockchain and, the future tech. So in this ecosystem, right, they see a world where 5G is coming. Everything, will be connected to some sort of Skynet thing, I guess, if you want to call it that. And, blockchain becomes sort of this immutable ledger that if all data goes to, and it's decentralized, it's an overused word, but if it's not necessarily owned by any one nation, right? That it is like the internet where it's just public and it's out there. Then, as we start to sort of, what's the word? When we merge with technology, there was a movie off of it. Oh, starts with a U. Anyways, so essentially in the future, if we start to merge with our tech, right? And everything, all of our biorhythms, biocharts, everything is measured in data. Then in blockchain, right? Every piece of data that's sent back and forth is a micropayment, right? It's just so small and insignificant. But what that would mean is in the future, you could even more so look at what is the actual value in a monetary standpoint. All the way through.
You just took me way back because I used to work in a micropayments company in Silicon Valley.
Wow.
It was, I have a long history of working in companies like decades before they're ready.
Ooh, trendsetter. Ahead of your time.
Getting closer with the community thing. It's only been a decade to catch up.
I mean, well, you were ahead as well, right? In terms of the community sector or profession, because still people, a lot of organizations are. I mean, I was on a call today as well, talking about communities for startups, and like why they should build a community and what have you. But it's like even in the startup world, there are a lot who don't even understand like how a community is supposed to work, for their business. And this is why, you were talking before about the socioeconomic side. Like, so you're looking at structure, and the more I dig deep, the more I realize just how all of it is connected. Structure is important.
It's all connected. And actually, you want to hear my really off-color metaphor for why you need communities? I mean, it's off-color.
Go for it.
This partner does not really like when I say this. We're among friends. When you're a company and you're looking for a customer to close a sale, you're very transaction focused. And when you're very transaction focused, it's a very expensive way to operate. Because you kind of force the transaction, then the customer is not exactly bought in. And so they're a contentious customer from the start because they feel like you kind of bullied them. They weren't quite ready, but like you gave them such a structural deal, a financial deal, that they signed on the bottom line because whatever. But that you kind of ruined the relationship a little bit in the process. And so now they cost a lot to support because they're always like, well, I'm going to get my money's worth if you force me into this, right? And they beat you up. And so you don't have a partnership model. And then you want a renewal or you want to add something and you're at that whole process again. And it's expensive. If you let customers come to you, they're not very expensive and they're partners because you've convinced them and you've let them come in the time they want to. And so my really off-color analogy is if you want sex, there's two ways to get it. You can pay a shitload of money for it, or you can flirt. Right? And if you're willing to flirt, you get sex for free. And the next time you get it for free again. Right? Like, because
and hopefully you get better at it.
you have a relationship, right? You're not forcing it. You're not saying, I want it right now. You're not controlling it. And that is a hard one for like, and I use that metaphor because it usually people are like, oh, like it's a very succinct way of making that point. But if you look at your financial model, it's the same way. So if you build communities, what you can do is really lower your acquisition rate or costs and lower your overall total costs to support a customer. The problem with it is our VC model and how we fund companies and the expectation that you go big, right? Very quickly because you can't control it as much. So like, and that's the tough thing, right? Because VCs come in and they're saying, you've got 18 months to like, boom, right? And so again, we need these financial models for communities so that we can educate funders and stakeholders and say, this is kind of how long this will take, and this is how much it will cost to get there, so that they really lay off a little bit. And again, not to bring everything back to racism, but like that 1619 article, the other thing that it pointed out is the plantation system is what created this boom and bust economic model, right? Because what happened is they came over to the New World, they grew cotton and tobacco, both of which really extracted everything from the soil. And they wore out the soil. And then the US government stole some land from native tribes, sold it for a fraction of its cost to big plantations, and they just kept moving west. And so they were very extractive. They didn't pay their employees. They didn't pay for their land, right? They took advantage of both of those things. But they also created this boom and bust, unsustainable economic model in our heads, and this expectation that we go big fast.
Yes.
And
Yep. No, 100. I was reading. I remember being introduced to the 7th-generation model from a Native American tribe. I don't know if you've heard of it, the 7th-generation
you have
principle.
mentioned it before, and I need to look it up.
Yeah. No, it's really fascinating because, I guess one of the things about, I guess ancestors, indigenous tribes, right, is that they figured out how to make things sustainable, right, for like generations. We, in our arrogance, again, right, thinking that because we are ahead in the future, that, we know better. And this whole, big and fast thing, as you said, has created a lot of stressors, right?
Yes.
Booms and busts. Yep. And this actually ties back to what I was talking about, the biohistory. They were saying these stressors is actually what contributes to things like racism, etc., because it just creates more pressure, right?
Loneliness, anxiety, gun violence issues, whatever. And actually, it's interesting because I was on my sabbatical and I read this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know who suggested it. My network is fabulous. They suggested all these books that I'd never heard of. Anyways, it's about a Native American descendant who lives in upstate New York and is a botanist. And it's a very lyrical book, but also just has that sustainable mindset of how we live with the earth and how we live with each other and how we live with animals. And so I read that, and then I went to a play called Gloria. It was about Gloria Steinem. And again, like we don't get half of our history in school, or at least if I got it, it did not sink in. But at the end of the play, and I didn't know this about Gloria Steinem, but she has delved really deeply into Native philosophy. And she pointed out that a lot of our US Constitution is based on it. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who was really kind of obsessed with the Iroquois model.
Iroquois, yep. And
they came to the Constitutional Convention, and because it was a play about Gloria Steinem, she pointed out that they were like, where are all the women? Like, where are the women here? Like, and so like, again, all of these things are colliding around, we need different structures for how we organize ourselves and how we work. And it's interesting because we also try to practice what we preach at the Community Roundtable. And we have a fairly small team, so we're not at the scale of a lot of organizations. But we work in a completely different way. It's very flexible. It pushes a lot of efficacy down to the individual. It's not consensus driven, meaning people have their responsibilities, but we're constantly giving each other feedback and working out loud, and everybody can see everything. And we're so enormously productive, but we don't work long hours. And generally speaking, it's not always the case, but generally speaking, it's very relaxed, right? We have those moments of stress where things need to get done and whatever, but and you'd have to ask the other people on my team, because leaders are like, executives are never the ones to really understand how people are feeling.
Somebody on the team's like, yeah, sure, Rachel.
So somebody could be like, yeah, no, that's not how I feel. But it's a more joyful environment. Like, it's a healthier, like, just as an individual working, like, and so at the end of the day, doesn't everybody want that? Like, shouldn't our economic models serve us as humans rather than some weird bank account somewhere? And that's not to say that I'm communist, right? Like, each community wants to maximize its value, but I just don't think it has to be set up structurally as competitively as it is.
But, you know, this is another thing I notice about like Americans, especially on Twitter, right? Anything that is, anything that's not individualistic in its tone is communist, right? Or this, like, I've noticed the psyche of the American people is they're so afraid of socialism and communism.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, what's been your take or observation as well? Like, because looking at the history of the United States, I understand why, right? But how has that also shaped, you know, your structure and your power, the power plays?
It's been huge, right? And I've been listening to Heather Cox Richardson recently. She's a historian, and she just wrote a book about how the South won the Civil War. And what she's talking about is the oligarchic model won out, right? It's not a democratic model. The oligarchic model won out.
Yeah.
And she talks about the economic and social pieces that led to that. And then she talks a lot about the narratives put forward by politicians to get support for that, which is that individual, anti-socialist, whatever. But if you look at all the academic research around humans, you're so like to think that we can be individual is asinine, right? I mean, and I think this COVID crisis is actually helping people understand that a little bit, because all of a sudden people are alone. They can't get together and they're stressed. And you're like, yes, because that is not how humans work, right? We do things together. We find joy and innovation and creativity and energy together, not by ourselves in a closet. So you have to ignore all of that. And oh, never mind the mirroring behaviors and how we socially norm to each other. Like, that's a whole different layer, right?
It's like, no, if you do that, you're a sheep, you know, like
and I'm like, no, everybody does that. So I think we need to have a come to Jesus around that a little bit, right? But the words have gotten so much hubris behind them that when you say them, you can't have the conversation, because just saying the word shuts down the conversation. And it's a little like the word racist, right?
Yeah.
Once you say that, you're not going to have a conversation. Now, anybody in the US who has grown up here is part of the racist system. It's in our DNA, right? Like, we cannot get away from it. What I was thinking about the other day is, I think it's a misnomer to call individuals racist, because racism is fundamentally a systemic problem. Prejudice is an individual issue. Right. But racism is used as a weapon against individuals, right? You're racist. Yeah. Right. And I'm like, well, yeah, because I'm here and I'm human and I grew up saturated in this stuff.
Normalized.
But that's not the question for me that I need to explore is not whether I'm prejudiced, but how is the structure making it easy or difficult for me? And racism and sexism are very, like, they're virtually the same from that perspective, and from the systemic perspective. And so everyone has it's benefited me in this way and it's made it hard for me in this way. And so that's the question, not do you feel racist? Do you categorize yourself? Like, nobody, even the white supremacist, well, maybe they would come out and say I'm a white supremacist. Too far away from that mental model to understand how they think about themselves. But very few people think of themselves as intentionally causing harm to someone else.
Yeah.
Like we think of ourselves as good people.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like, so starting that antagonistic conversation is a non-starter.
Yep. Shuts it down automatically.
It's the same thing with socialism and communism. Like, it's been so kind of beaten over the head that that's not the way you can have a conversation about this.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Because I know whenever, and it's fascinating, right? Because you look at the conflict, right, between our actions show that we are seekers of community or seekers of belonging, right? And you get that belonging with other people. Yeah. And I would agree with you on the thinking that we are pure individuals, that, you know, we don't need others or that sort of thing. It is asinine because it's like you can't really even understand yourself or experience yourself without, you know, that relation to others.
The feedback from other people is what helps you understand how you're the same or different from them.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, I think that's why it's fascinating to see, especially when you have technically a community of individualists as well. Like, that's the irony, you know, you got all these individualists and they have the shared, you know, belief, right, that they are individualists, and they defend that. And it's all the characteristics of a community as well. And yet they're like, nope, we're all individuals.
It's funny, and that may be the reason I do a lot of Trojan horse style programming, which is I'm not telling people what I'm actually doing. I give them a different reason that's valid, but not the real reason I'm doing things.
Yep.
Usually to make people collide with each other, because that's what's going to give them the win. Yep. But yeah, it's an interesting. I often say, like, at least in the U.S., our core, like, the thing we're just superpowers at is denial, right? Like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we're very, the flip side of that is we're very aspirational. We want to be perfect, but that makes us deny all the ways that we're still learning or still growing. And I happen to think, like, there's so much divisiveness in the country right now. And because my family is from a very different area from where I grew up, in a very different political, economic environment, I see so much more similarity than difference, right? And it feels like we're being split apart by people who are adding hubris to language.
Interesting. Yeah, there was I had a chat with another friend of mine who's based in Cali and California, because I know Cali, I've learned recently, is also another place in South America. But yeah, he's based in California, I believe. And he was talking about, like, he wanted my perspective on the U.S. as a foreigner, as an outsider, right? You know, and I gave it to him straight. I'm like, what I see for the United States is what I saw with Greece. It's like, you were once a great empire. You are in the transition out, and you're clawing on for dear life. And the natural optimism that made you guys great is commendable, but you are ignoring all the signs that is showing. And also now, like, they're also, with all the cycles, the booms and busts of empires, you are going through the same predictable patterns of an empire coming out. And so now we are at that point where there is a restructuring happening, right? There is usually a new world order gets formed. The wars and revolutions, we're in that period right now. You know, I'm also hearing news about China, you know, being here in Singapore.
Oh, interesting.
China's ramping up. They're having tension with India. They're pushing stuff to Hong Kong and Taiwan. And, you know, they've denied Australia an independent investigation of the Wuhan virus. My opinion is China was once a great empire before too, right? Like, we can't forget that.
Yeah.
America, still, right? And America, in the scheme of all that, very small, you know? And that's not to say that the United States can't redeem themselves, right? But if we look at what's happening right now, a lot is showing that like they're not learning from their past, and the hubris that you're talking about is still present.
Yeah.
And so I want the United States to still be that beacon of, you know, freedom and hope and liberty and whatnot. But it's that whole thing of like going back to like even a family, right? Charity begins at home. You got to fix your own problems before you start pointing fingers to other people. And when I say you, of course, I'm looking at right, not you individually, Rachel, but the United States.
I'm sure I'm guilty of some of that. So.
But you know, and that's just one of the unfortunate things about being born in particular countries too. There are benefits, but there are also disadvantages, because now from the outside, a lot of people don't want to even touch the United States now.
Yeah.
Like I don't even want to go anywhere near the United States for a good while.
I don't really, and I'm here.
You know. But that wasn't the case, right? The United States used to be the place to go to be free. And then that was, I guess, the dream, you know? And for many people, they were able to work their way up and live the American dream. But now they're also realizing, damn, was it just that, a dream? You know, is the reality a lot harsher?
We've gone back and forth. We have a real history of like moving from one end of the thing to the other. So TBD on that, because I keep thinking of the Winston Churchill quote, which is, we'll exhaust all our options and then finally do the right thing.
Yes. Yep.
But we've got to exhaust all the bad options.
Well, it is still the best. I mean, you know, a lot of people talk about the United States being the best experiment, right? In terms of bringing that many people of different opinions and whatnot together and still having them feel like Americans. It is probably the most successful experiment of its kind, you know, to date.
Well, and if you kind of put it in historical context, it was revolutionary at the time. I think what we're not realizing is there's another revolution happening.
Yes.
In terms of philosophical models of how we engage and create value and distribute value. And America is not necessarily the hotbed of that. So, you know, I keep looking at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and I think she's got it right, which is, you know, the GDP is, or the stock market, and you can see this now, the stock market is still going up. And
it's living in its own world.
You're like, this is divorced from reality right now. And so that's not an indicator of how healthy we are. But that's what everybody points to. They're like, oh, the stock market's great. And like the other bizarre thing about this is a lot of people that point to the stock market being great have no investments in the stock market, right? It doesn't help them one iota. And they're looking at it and been like, well, you know, if that's doing okay, then I must be doing okay. And I'm like,
you didn't learn how to read that properly then.
Well, like, just look around you. Like, are you feeling anxious? Well, then the stock market's not actually helping you. So anyway, so like, we didn't really talk about the research much, but all of this philosophical underpinning is why I'm excited by the research, because it's finally gotten to a point where we have the benchmarks and the tools to make the case to say there is a different way we could do this, and here's how. Because for years, people in the E2O, digital transformation, whatever you want to call this space, have been talking about the potential of it.
Yeah.
But it's all this idea of how we could be. And there's not, like, what we've really tried to focus on is, but how? Like, operationally and tactically, what does that look like? Because until we have that, you can't actually change.
Yeah. I brought it up for you in case you wanted to go through, you know, and So, you tell me which pages.
So there's 3 infographics, which are kind of the summaries of, and we structured this report a little differently this year. The first key finding is really the market narrative. And then we took a look at external customer communities and then internal communities, because this was the first year that I could see significant and consistent differentiation between how they were being managed and the value that they were getting out. In past years, there's been some differences, but not consistent, and it hasn't been entirely clear what the story is. This year, it was much clearer, so I pulled that out. But again, the big high level thing is this generative value and looking at advanced communities and seeing how much they're investing in structural change was really important to me, because that's what's supercharging their ability to generate value.
Got it.
So that's one.
Yep.
Any other, what struck you as particularly interesting?
For me, let me go through. I think I loved this. I'm a fan of the infinity model anyways. But I think this is, because I also look at, there's conspiracy theories galore, but there's this one guy named Stephen Greer, who came out with this. I don't know if you've heard of him before or not. Okay, Dr. Stephen Greer, he came out, I think it was 2008 or 2011 as well, with something called the Disclosure Project. And he was talking about literally alien technologies. And he was saying that a lot of, the technologies that we talk about in science fiction, like a lot of it does exist already. And, he worked with a lot of these other secret organizations, etc. And I often listen to these guys, just in case they're right about some things, And, he was talking about Nikola Tesla back in the day, created the free energy devices, right? And even if you look at sort of flying saucers, etc., they follow this same sort of infinity model. And he was talking about how, like, the structures, right? Our technologies reflect our own people structures as well, right? And before it was pyramid shape, right? And then with something like what you have here, it's more infinitely generative, right? With the infinity symbol. And so he's talking about like the next wave of technology that's coming out post 5G, etc. It's literally reflecting that sort of level up in consciousness. So he's saying we live in a 3-dimensional world. The movie Interstellar talked about the 5-dimensional world, right? And he was saying the reason why we might go from a 3-dimensional to 5-dimensional is because we actually had access to the 4-dimensional, but our power structures in the world prevented us from tapping into that. And so what we're experiencing now is literally a burst because of all the suppression, a burst into a next dimension.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny because that one chart represents about 10 years of research, right? Like we finally consolidated it into one chart. And I think most people reading this probably don't realize that, but I'm like,
it took 10 years.
A lot of work on all of our parts at the CR, but on my research.
Yeah, beautiful. Well. I think the ROI is something that I definitely have been. It's why I also find myself more and more, even though I consider myself a community guy, I have jumped more and more into fintech, into finance, into money as well, because I also saw how much that impacts communities.
Yeah.
Right.
But the other piece that this brings up too is the inclusivity of advanced communities. They get that value by including more people. And it got me to thinking about this. And I'm like, our pyramid structures of organizations today, diversity is a bug right now. So it's an exception.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we really need to make diversity the rule, not the exception, right? We need a model that maximizes your uniqueness, because that's your value, right? And it's a demand supply thing, right? At an individual level, your value is the things that make you unique. And our organizations have forced us to get into these boxes because they need a widget, again, a production mentality. I need a widget to do this. And that denies our humanity. And it's impossible for us to do sustainably. And so I also think communities are kind of a way to do that. That is very important.
I'm bringing up something now. I don't know if I shared this term with you before, third culture kids. Have you heard of this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's a but third culture kids, in my opinion, are kind of like the model for like the next generation of citizen, right? Because Barack Obama is actually a third culture kid. And if you look into his background, essentially mixed upbringing. And myself and various others that I know, we all went to like these international schools. Now, very privileged, and we benefited a lot, right? But we had stressors of being in foreign lands, foreign countries, right? And
that's really funny because I was an exchange student in high school.
And this is where, right, if you study, right, if you study that, you study a lot of other TCKs, third culture kids, they all have this inherent understanding that, you know, we definitely are all one. All the cultures that we kind of mix and share with one another. I've never met a racist third culture kid. It's like, it's hard to find because they've been exposed to so many different cultures.
You know what I found? Like, I had this aha when I came back from my year abroad. I was in Germany, so it wasn't that broadly different, but I came back, and in Germany, I always had to like double check meaning because I was learning the language. So I always had to double check what somebody meant.
Yeah.
And I realized when I came back that we all speak the same language, but we don't mean the same thing. And we have to double check, even though like I understood the words you said, but I'm not sure I understood what you meant by that. And so it gives you that flexibility of translation and thought, and that liminal space of like, this doesn't necessarily mean this same thing. Yeah. And you learn a couple languages, and I always laugh that like in German, there's like 20 different ways to say you're an idiot. In France, it's 20 different ways to say I love you, right? So there's also like different, we have more words in different cultures for different things too, which is interesting.
Exactly. And I think that's a thing, you know, you look at what's happening in the United States as well. Like a lot of the times, and with communities, we know this, right? Like communities, half the time, it's actually people just want to feel heard, right? That they're being listened to. And especially when you hear these things about like, you know, they're shouting Black Lives Matters. And then you have people saying, no, all lives matter. And it's like, it's reiterating the issue where it's like, you're not listening again, right?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's, I think is definitely, if people could start to walk in each other's shoes a bit more, right?
It gets back to the socialist communist thing, right? People have this very rigid idea of like, you say socialist and they actually think of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And that is what that means. And I'm like, it can mean a lot of different, like socialist can look very different depending on
which country, right? Which part of the world you go to, exactly. Oh my Lord. I actually, there's a question, I think, which was in relation to back to this model, just from YouTube. We got a question from Nikki. How do migrant displaced communities fit into, I'm assuming, this model? Here, yes. Yeah. Interesting one, huh?
Well, it's interesting. And what I would say is one that was not our research population. We look at organizationally sponsored communities. So that limits who we're looking at. I do think it has applicability across that, because actually the thing that commercially sponsored communities help us do is put financial value to things because they're, you know, whatever. But this model is also, there's a constant tension between inclusion and exclusion. And this model is looking at one exclusive community, not across communities. So that question is a little hard to answer because
accurately, yeah.
Yeah, are you talking about bringing that community into another community? Or are you talking about the community itself and how it generates that? So like, it doesn't answer that question. I don't, well, and I don't exactly understand the question she has, but I don't think it would answer the question.
Okay. Yeah, Nikki, if you're still watching, feel free to expand on it. And as I go through, might be able to come back. But I mean, from a quick level, looking at what you have here, I think it goes back again to just highlighting the value of your efforts as well, right? In working potentially with migrant displaced communities. Because I know, right, if you look at, one thing I've noticed is that when people are talking about communities, again, people have different definitions. When we're talking about communities, we often come from the business perspective, and we're constantly trying to show the value of what we're doing, right? And I think actually in not-for-profit sectors, NGOs, et cetera, it's already a given that they're working with communities, for the good of it all. But they still have to go out and do their charity runs and, and justify, their activities, et cetera. So I could see how this would be applied in being able to showcase, more of the ROI.
And actually, do you know Angela Blanchard?
No.
She ran a huge community foundation in Houston for years, $300 million community foundation. And she said to me once on Twitter, I think we were chatting, and she said, your budget is your best advocacy tool, right? Because money and how you budget is how you express what you value.
Huh, interesting.
I've got to leave it at that because I am.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes, we went way over an hour. Sorry, Rachel.
And we could chat forever about
I know we could. Please, no, go back, go to your meeting.
Yeah, but if you have questions, I'm happy to try and answer them on Twitter or some other way.
Not a problem. We'll tag you. But thank you so much, Rachel, as always. And yeah, I'll include all your links and speak soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, George. Bye.
No worries. Bye.